Two guys in the dark.
My buddy Gavin had always tried to be a superhero. Yes, you heard that right. Not that he always loved superheroes. Not even that he always wanted to be a superhero. He just made a costume and a mask. And when we were in middle school, we had been crusading around the neighborhood to stop crime, all the way up until I was a sophomore in high school. I'm sure you've heard about most people like this in the news, like the people in that movie Kick-Ass. Gavin and I lived in the St. Cloud projects, and even though I doubt that he helped in any way, there was a lot of crime and drug dealing to go around. The most difficult thing for Gavin, I think, was that he lived in Minnesota, a state that doesn't allow wearing masks in public. While most beat cops that come around our neighborhood, they all just laughed at Gavin and his mask antics. There was one cop that would have none of it, Officer Mitchell. He had a real hard-on for Gavin, or the Depths as he called his alter ego, and always demand he take off the mask and not go around in disguise in public. More on him later. In truth, Gavin's outfit was pretty sweet. It was all black. The fabric was flowing, but not too baggy, and the mask was made of this tough black plastic. It looked kind of like a skull, and the eye lenses were a piercing silver tint. He'd actually been working on it for a year. Every night after school, instead of hanging out or doing his homework, he'd go into the basement and sew up his costume. I kept telling him that he could just buy a Halloween getup from Kmart, which would be a lot less traceable, but he insisted on making his own. As you can probably gather, he was big into Batman, and just like the character, would only work at night. This helped him avoid Officer Mitchell a few times when being chased down so that he wouldn't be unmasked. The outfit was perfect camouflage for the dark alleyways. A lot of people, including teachers and most of the grown-ups in the projects, had figured that Gavin was mentally unstable, or retarded as they say. I never thought that was accurate though. And if I'm being totally fair, Gavin was an averagely smart kid who was just preoccupied with things that took away from him ever getting good grades, or learning anything that would get him a job. He wasn't crazy. He'd just been through a lot. His parents divorced when he was 5. Before you dismiss this experience as just another typical 21st century reality, you should know that his father was in deep gambling debt, and his mother was hooked on crack from the Minneapolis Crips. I'll let you imagine how all this played out for young Gavin when the three of them were living under the same roof. They didn't so much divorce as they separated, and really neither of them was fit to raise Gavin as he went to live with his grandfather. When his grandfather croaked, he went into foster homes, getting passed along 7 times in 4 years. He eventually landed back in St. Cloud with his older third cousin Howie, twice removed. Howie did shift to work at a supermarket warehouse and didn't have much time or patience for Gavin, so you can imagine what their relationship was like. I actually remember going along with Gavin, or the Depths, a few times when he scoured the streets at night for trouble. I don't know why, but for some reason he was never bothered with me knowing his secret identity. In truth, when you live in the ghetto, there's little that your neighbors don't know about you. Anyways, I remember one night I tagged along with the Depths after he'd heard the news of serial rapists in the area. I wasn't in costume, but he was, as well as Durwood, his sidekick. Now, trying to be a superhero in real life is pretty pathetic, but being the sidekick to a Fox superhero, that's got to be the shits. We mostly drank coffee and soda, freezing our balls off on the street corner and spying on the opposite side, looking for anything suspicious. Now Durwood and I, after an hour and a half, had had enough. There was nothing there except for a few drunks, ranting crazies, and maybe a hooker in a long trench coat. The Depths, however, refused to call it a night, insisting that we'd find the rapist. Not long after, we saw this tall man wearing baggy, layered clothing who kept circling the block over and over again. "That guy keeps circling back," Gavin hissed through the mask. Durwood and I looked at each other, and even though we weren't friends, we could read the concerned panic in the other's eyes. I think that we both knew the shit was about to hit the fan when we heard that Gavin's paper cup hit the sidewalk. Gavin, like a shadow crossing your room when a car goes by at night, lurched forward and ran to the other side. He got right up and grabbed the guy by the lapels of his coat, yelling at him, demanding to know where his whereabouts on such and such a date. A struggle ensued. I watched from the other side, paralyzed. Durwood stood next to me like a statue. A fist flew from the man, and he shouted, "The fuck's with you, freak? Get the fuck off of me!" Gavin then retaliated with one of those karate punches he'd taught himself from online videos, and it did rock the guy back a few steps. Then the next thing I saw brought a swell of feverish heat bubbling to the otherwise shivering body. From out of the guy's deep pocket, he brought out a gleamingly silver snub-nosed revolver. He pointed it, titled it to the side at Gavin's head. "Get the fuck off me, bruh." Gavin didn't move, and I thought then that it was over. But he suddenly reached up, grabbed the guy by the wrist of the hand holding the gun. I sunk back into the shadows and heaved, watching the gray barrel tether and sway in several directions as the two of them grappled for it. Without a word, Durwood ran forward to the scene. I watched in abject horror as he got closer to the point of the flaying firearm. I sunk deeper into the darkness. I then leapt and waxed cold upon the thunder of the gun's shots. The bullet ricocheted across the concrete, and the weapon fell from the man's hand as both Gavin and Durwood pushed him to the ground. I don't know if it was the second person or the gun firing, but the man scrambled to his feet and then scampered away. I watched the two of them panting, Gavin much more than Durwood. Then, before they walked back across the road, Durwood stepped down and picked something up off the sidewalk. When they brought it over, we saw that it was a small plastic packet of meth. The guy had been a drug dealer, which would explain why he'd been circling the block over and over. The elusive serial rapist had never been found. Durwood seemed the most embarrassed about the debacle. Gavin figured that he was still stopped in justice. Me, I stopped tagging along, but I know that most of his crusades ended up in street fights. Some that he lost, some that he won. Sometimes he'd get unmasked, but that was okay. They didn't know who he was anyways. I stopped paying much attention. Around this time, I was starting to think ahead a little bit. I was going into high school and wasn't too glad to be put into the lowest set class in one of the worst schools in the city. Gavin wasn't going to high school. He was instead focusing on his crime-fighting career. Truth is, he was terribly behaved. He was probably suffering from undiagnosed ADHD. In retrospect, our school just couldn't support him. The worst came about when Gavin collected up his paper route money and Christmas cash, and some pilfered dollars from Howie's wallet, I suspect, to buy a police radio. Like the karate moves that he taught himself, he soon figured out what each of the coded numbers stood for. 3 days after this purchase, our projects got introduced to Officer Mitchell. He went door to door with a sketch of the mask that Gavin wore as the depths. Luckily for Gavin, no one in the projects talked to the cops, especially when it's about someone who lives there. This usually applies to drug dealers and gangsters, but they didn't make an exception for a mildly disturbed would-be superhero. Officer Mitchell came to my door last. My mother, who was home, told him that she'd never seen anyone wearing that mask before, but called me over to take a look. Mitchell had told her that he believed the suspect was a child. I took a look and immediately recognized the skeletal quality of the mask. Regardless, I shook my head no. The officer then kneeled down and looked into my eyes. He smelt like burnt coffee and sweat, and his face was puffy. His eyes were cold. Shifty. "Are you sure about that, son? No idea who this character could be?" Again, I shook my head no. He then stood up, adjusted his uniform, and then thanked my mother. He left, but I knew that he knew I was lying. I felt a chill go up my spine, and it lingered there long after he'd left. After that, and with much prodding from me and Durwood, Gavin finally decided to stop going out at night. "All right," he told us. "I'll wait for something big over the radio." This wasn't exactly reassuring, but was enough to settle my nerves, for the time being at least. One night, the three of us were hanging out in Howie's cramped basement, playing Xbox and sipping on some of the canned beer from the fridge, the police radio occasionally buzzing in the background. After we got to the final level of the game, the radio buzzed rather loudly with Car 64, be advised, 261, and a possible 217 in progress on Young in Lexington. Durwood and I heard it, but neither of us paid it any mind. Gavin, though, he sat right up. His ears were perked, dropped his controller to the floor. 10-4, this is Car 64 on pursuit to location. Over. Gavin jumped up, rushing towards the radio, and putting his ear right next to the speaker. Durwood and I were still sitting on the carpet, but my head was turned. What's up, Gavin? Shh, he hissed, then promptly put his ear back to the radio. There's a rape happening 10 blocks from us. At that moment, I felt cold wash over me. I turned off the game and listened with him. Several minutes crawled by of nothing, just the low fizzle of the radio static. Then we hear the officer's voice return. Dispatch, this is Car 64. We have a 217 requesting medical. Over. I didn't need to know the codes to figure out what had happened. The victim was dead. Roger, Car 64. Is a suspect in the area? Over. Negative, dispatch. Suspect is reported to be a number 1 male, possibly local. Witness say that he fled scene going west off a furlong. Notify all cars of the situation. 10-4. Durwood's hands then collapsed on Gavin's shoulder, and I could see that he was wincing. Maybe they'll catch him, I said pathetically. He's right, Durwood jumped in. No point in going over there. Come on, calm down. It took a few moments of restraining him, but Gavin agreed to stay in the basement. He turned on the TV and channel surfed for a bit, mostly watching cartoons. Durwood and I each popped open a new beer. Gavin didn't even finish his already opened one. Didn't even touch it, or even look at it. He just sat there, next to the radio, his eyes staring lifeless at nothing. The next day I saw the front cover of the newspaper. Hideous rape murder on Young in Lexington. Police officers in hot pursuit of the evasive culprit. This wasn't good. I didn't see Gavin for 2 weeks straight. I called his house a couple of times, but each time I either got an answering machine or his cousin, telling me that he was out and didn't know where he was. I was scared then. This was pretty bad. All I knew was the details of the suspect as they were relayed on the radio. It didn't take me long to find out that number 1 meant black. I didn't want to know how the depths was going out finding this guy. By the 3rd week, on a Wednesday afternoon after school, I heard an uncommon sound for our block, coming outside of my window. Heavy tires crunching over the ragged pavement. Anytime a car came through our projects, it usually meant one thing: cops. I looked out my window to see a squad car had pulled into our block. It was slowly creeping towards Gavin's house. My mind filled with tears of the worst, and I dashed down the steps and flew out of our front stoop. I watched Officer Mitchell emerge. His face was rigid, his movements stiff and sudden. He then jerked open the passenger door, and there was Gavin. His face was exposed, bloodied, one eye blackened and swollen shut, his hands cuffed behind him. Mitchell dragged Gavin towards the door, Gavin giving little resistance, showing even less mental presence. The policeman rapped his knuckles hard on the door, but no one ever came. Howie was working double shifts that week and hadn't been home. I looked around and saw everybody on our block watching out the windows or over the fences, at least those that had fences. "Where is your parental unit?" Mitchell demanded, shaking Gavin's bound form violently. Gavin shrugged. Mitchell gave him another shake and shouted in his face. I could feel the eyes of our block peering heavier on both of them. Officer Mitchell must have felt it too, because after taking a long glance at the scene around him, he went behind Gavin and took his cuffs off. Gavin was about to unlock his door and go into his house, but not before Officer Mitchell clasped his hands against the door and brandished Mitchell's mask in front of his face in a squelching grasp. "Listen to me, you little shit," he said low, but it carried an echo so that I could hear it. "Do yourself a favor and throw this and that stupid outfit in the trash. I see you wearing it again anywhere, and I'll arrest you for suspicion of mischief, and we'll see if you can even get a hate crime charge tied to you, eh?" He then threw the mask hard at Gavin's feet. Hate crime? Oh, Jesus, I thought. Had Gavin actually been going around the neighborhood harassing random black guys because of what he'd heard on the radio? Officer Mitchell grabbed his heavy belt under his paunch and adjusted his trousers. "Your guardian or parent will be called later this week to inform them of the situation. Have a nice day." The eyes of the project faded back into the house as Mitchell's prowler peeled off, and Gavin's door had slammed shut. I was glad to know that Gavin was okay, and thought at the time that the whole thing was over. Looking back, I now know how wrong I was. The next day I invited Gavin over, and the two of us hung out in my room. We were there to play cards, but mostly I needed to know what had happened. The first thing that I asked was about the shiner he had. "Did that prick Mitchell do that to you?" He shook his head, almost smiling. "Nah, this was from one of the rapists." I must have looked at Gavin with complete confusion. He then relayed to me how there had been more than one rapist murderer, and there had been in fact been 5, maybe 10 who were involved in killing that girl. And the term he kept using, "I swear to you, Corey, there's literally hundreds of them." "What do you mean?" His eyes shifted to my door, perhaps checking that it was closed. Then he leaned closer and said, "The blacks." My heart started pounding in my chest. Was I really hearing this? He then told me how John Dyke, at whose house he had stayed on 2-week hunt, had told him about the uncontrollable lust that apparently all blacks have for raping white women. This theory wasn't surprising. John Dyke had grown up just a few years before us, in our projects, and was now an active Nazi skinhead. What shocked me was that Gavin had bought this crap. For Christ's sake, the girl who had been killed hadn't even been white. "I'm not even going to bother fighting street crime anymore," he lectured on. "The real criminals that are sucking our community dry are being projected by the government. The immigrants taking our jobs. The Spanish spreading drugs. The gays and the lesbians poisoning our family." I had to stop him right there. Both my parents are Ukrainian Jews, so you can imagine how pissed off I was getting. Also, Gavin, Durwood and I were from 3 of only 5 white families in a majority of Hispanic ghetto. How the fuck could he believe all this neo-Nazi BS? "You're being an asshole," I told him, and I could feel myself shaking, not used to standing up for myself, and especially for other people. "John Dyke is one of those guys. Everything you're saying now is wrong, and what you're doing around the city is worse. It happens to be racist." He then told me in a cold, automatic monotone that racism doesn't exist. I lost it at that point. We both got into a big shouting match, and by the end, Gavin called me a horrible word, and then stormed out of the room. I couldn't get his words out of my head the whole night, and I kept shaking and grinding my teeth together. In the week that followed, I mostly stayed in my room after school. When I checked my email account, I saw that there was a message from Durwood. Oh great, the sidekick, I thought. Figured that it was Gavin's attempt to make some kind of amends to me, without even apologizing, by proxy. I deleted the message without reading it, and got on with my homework. The next day there was another message from Durwood. Again I dumped it without reading. On the 3rd day I had calmed down a bit over the whole thing, and was legitimately curious now. To my surprise, the message had nothing to do with Gavin. Durwood's message was a simple, "Hey, how's it going?" He even asked me about what homework was like in freshman year. Nothing to do with what had transpired between Gavin and me at all. Pleased with the friendly hello, I responded in kind, asking him how he was doing. 15 minutes later, there was a reply. We ended up chatting into the late evening until midnight. We continued doing this over the next couple of nights, and actually started hanging out after school. It was kind of nice since we only knew each other through Gavin, who seemed to be no longer in the picture. It was great that I had a new friend without completely separating myself from my past circle. Over the next month, I found out that he and I had a lot in common. One Friday night, when we were munching on tacos and cheese at the local arcade, he confided to me what it was like being Gavin's sidekick. It was horrible, man. He had told me while shaking his head, which was hanging very low at this point. Everything he wanted to do since he was 5, and I was 3, I had to go along with. He wanted to play Lone Ranger. I was Tonto. And any bullshit adventure that he wanted to do. I got stuck tagging along. He interrupted himself with a joyless scoff. Did he ever tell you about the time when he was 9 and he wanted to live out in the wilderness so that he made me go with him to go camping out in the woods in Barrett Park? Shit. By the time that they found us, I had poison ivy all over my arms and had eaten a damn grub. Yuck. Well, why did you go along with him? I asked. How did you two even end up as friends? Because, he said with a long emphasis, his mother went to school with my mom. I guess she felt obligated after what happened. I nodded my head for a little bit. That did make sense for the initial relationship. But, I began again. Why did you just do whatever he said? You don't have to do what he wants just because he's your friend, or your mom wants you to. You're your own person. He then hid his eyes behind his hands. I soon realized that he was holding his head, looking as if he was about to be sick. I then heard him say, in a weak, weak voice, "There's even more. There's more. He just has this power over me. I just can't get loose of him. Fuck." Not knowing what to do, and very uncomfortable, I patted him on the shoulder and told him that it'd be all right. I suppose there was more that he could have told me, but honestly, I didn't want to know. Life was much easier for the next couple of months. No more craziness. No more bullshit. For the first time in my life, I was actually friends with someone who wasn't toxic and wasn't so demanding of my time. I was actually doing well in school, and there were talks of putting me in higher set class for the next fall. After Easter weekend, however, I got back in touch with Gavin. It was early in the morning. 5 a.m. early. I could hear my phone vibrate on my bedside table. I picked it up without looking at it, the caller ID, and then answered it. "Hello," I said, rubbing my eyes. "Corey," I heard Gavin's voice crack. "You gotta let me come over. Jesus, I need your help." Hearing the panic in his voice jolted me awake. I pressed the phone closer to my ear. "Calm down, dude. What's happening?" "There's a news story about me. They're saying that I killed Officer Mitchell." My nerves locked. My body completely froze. "No." "Listen, I heard him beg over the phone. I'm about 10 minutes away. I'll sneak in through your backyard door to the basement. Your parents should still be asleep, right?" "Yeah," I muttered, just audible, hoping in fact that he couldn't hear it. "Great," he told me, and I bit my lip hard. "I'll be there soon." "Wait," I stopped him, and to my relief, the call was still in progress. "Why can't you hide at Dyke's? He's further away from your house." I could hear him suck his teeth through the receiver. "John's gone. He's been out of town for a while now. I got nowhere else to hide." "All right, you can stay in my room for a day until I get back from school. Then we'll have to figure something out for you." He thanked me, and I heard the short, quiet chime of my phone indicating that the call had ended. Having all this time to wait, my mind whirling with sudden revelation, I searched the internet on my phone. Not long after, I found the news article titled, "St. Cloud Cop Slain by Masked Man," which was completely with a video. Apparently, Officer Mitchell had responded to a robbery that took place at a convenience store. I watched the video. The video was from a security camera videotaping the outside of the storefront. I could see, even in the grainy quality and microscopic screen on my phone, one of the windows had been broken. Just then, as Officer Mitchell was walking out of the front door, I saw it. A shadow moving fast right towards him. He turned his head just before the figure ran into him, but not fast enough. He fell to the ground, clutching his side. The article said that he had been stabbed with a knife. I then watched in absolute horror as the cop reached for his gun holster, and the darkly veiled figure grabbed at it too, the two of them struggling until there was a sudden flash, and the officer lay motionless on the ground. A spray of dark fluid stained the concrete behind his head. The figure then shot his lifeless person twice more before dropping the revolver and turning to leave. As it turned, I paused the video. The face was covered in a black skeletal mask, with the piercing silver-tinted eyes, the same from Gavin's costume. Gavin had still not arrived. Unsure how many knew the costume was his, I quickly dialed 911. When Gavin got to my house, he was out of breath, panting and soaked with sweat. I got him a glass of tap water and sat him down on my bed. He then told me the story in his own words. Listen, last night I was at home, okay? I had been out on patrol for a long while, and had caught a cold. For the last few days I've been in bed. I looked at Gavin closely. I could tell that he wasn't sick. You said you weren't going on patrol anymore. Yeah, he snapped hastily. But there's 2 fugitives reported in the news who were suspected of being in St. Cloud. I had heard nothing of this. I saw the video, I told him. The guy was wearing your costume. That's the thing, Gavin begged, reaching up at me and grabbing my shirt. I haven't worn that costume in months now. I swear to God, I threw it out in the trash. I told you, John and I were focusing on organizing strikes against immigrants who were taking our jobs. I wasn't going out and busting heads anymore. And there's the other crazy thing. There's no way that I could have known that a robbery had taken place. I listened, analyzing each word. He had mentioned details about the case that I knew from the news report. But of course he would. He probably saw the news story, which was why he panicked. But still, that's the thing, he rambled on. His eyes were wide, pulling harder on my shirt. 3 days ago, the police radio went missing. I don't know where it is. I put my hands on my arms and tried to ease him off of me. Just then, there came a hard, echoing knock from the front door. Police, open up! Gavin swiveled his head to the direction of the sound. He turned to look at me and seemed to search my face before springing up to look out the window. Police, he muttered, and his voice carried just enough for me to hear it. But how? He then turned. I stood up. I was ready to dash out the room, but for some reason, I just couldn't. You, he yelled, pointing his finger accusingly at me. You called the cops. I just stood there, stupid and silent, holding my arms up to try to gesture him for him to calm down. Without another second of hesitation, he sprang on me and began hitting me in the side with his knees and his fists. My life flashed before my eyes, as did the thought that I was alone with a killer. Help! I screamed, hoping that the police outside would hear me. Help! I wailed, and was soon cut off by a blow to the jaw. I raised my hands defensively over my head and curled up, trying to block his blows that were striking down hard all over my body. I didn't hear the front door get broken down, or even my bedroom door slam open, but I did hear Gavin scream as he was pulled off by 2 police officers. They then proceeded to pin him to the floor and cuff his hands. My skin was throbbing from the speed of the pulse, and I didn't feel any pain, though in truth I was badly beaten up. They hauled Gavin off, kicking and screaming, explaining that he was under arrest for the murder of a police officer, Sergeant Jerome Ferguson Mitchell. It didn't take them long to find Gavin guilty. They found the costume in the trash in front of his house, although he swore to God that he had gotten rid of it well before the murder took place. Beyond that, they had motive. Everyone in the projects had seen Gavin berated by Mitchell and knew that being a costume crusader meant to him. Still, it was like pulling teeth to get people to testify. Only thing was, they never found his police radio. Gavin's court-appointed lawyer tried to use this fact to raise doubt, since the prosecution kept arguing that Gavin had been known to have a police radio, which would explain how he knew the robbery took place, and how he knew Officer Mitchell would be there since he knew his car number. They ended up trying him as an adult, gave him 25 to life. I couldn't believe this, and it happened to him even with what he had done. Christ, he wasn't even 16 at the time. By the time I was nearly done with high school, the entire neighborhood had forgotten about Gavin. It was pretty much taboo to talk about him, and even Durwood, and I avoided the subject. But honestly, with time, we didn't care. We had both turned things around. When Durwood finished middle school, he went to the same school that I did, which made school so much better since I had my best friend to hang out with. By the time I was in my senior year, we had both joined a few school clubs, no teams I'm afraid, and started a games club of our own, and after moving up to some college prep classes, My grades were finally improving. I had attended a careers workshop and had made up my mind to go into an apprenticeship program for electricians. Durwood asked me about it later and decided that he would do the same thing after he graduated. The summer after my senior year, Durwood and his mother were moving out to Minneapolis. I was sad to see him go, but I could understand that maybe it was the best for him to leave all the bitter memories behind. The day he was going to move, I helped him pack. Around lunchtime, we were in his room, all of his things in tiny cardboard cubes around us. We took a break as we were both beat. Then his mom called him, and he asked to wait for me. After a few minutes, I got bored and tried to lift a few more boxes. Now all the boxes had been light up until now, mostly filled with clothing. This box that I lifted was unexpectedly heavy, and when I eased off the stack, it fell from my grip and crashed to the floor. The sealed top opened up on impact, and all the items spilled out on the carpet. I rushed to get everything back to the box, and that's when I saw what had given it so much weight. A black metallic radio. It was a police radio. Gavin's police radio. The same he swore that had gone missing 3 days before the murder took place. I sat there staring at it. I then heard footsteps creak outside of the room, and the door was squeaking open.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.